Hello, this is Matthias Goertz, and I'm sharing my monthly COVID-19 update as of 1st of March, 2021. And to this end, I will, as usual, share my screen with you. So the theme is Become Who You Are, and I will revert back to that. Let me start with this article by the BBC. Can't see this, so let me move this here. So in Japan, a country that is known for high suicide rates, in October last year, 70% more women killed themselves than in an average month of October. I don't know why they focused on women, but that's what they did. And there may be a variety of reasons, of course, but as always, let's assume that any excess mortality is due to COVID, as I'm doing in all my discussions. So we have 70% more fatalities from suicide, at least female suicides, in the month of October than in a usual month. This is just a little data point. It doesn't necessarily say anything by itself, but I think it's indicative. And it encouraged me to reflect again whether I'm allocating a sufficient portion of the total excess mortality to not directly COVID-linked fatalities, but rather indirectly COVID-linked fatalities, such as suicides that may arise from the lockdown and restrictions that people are, living under for 12 months by now. In October, it will have been 6 months or so, but it shows, right? And this is just one data point, and I didn't go and dig out a whole lot of more empirical data about this. I think it just tells a story for itself, and it has encouraged me to make some adjustments to my model again, and I will talk about that later. So, lots of suicides in the world, perhaps, which would not be surprising. The next thing that struck me, this happened in late January. The head of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and the then head of the Olympic Games in Tokyo, since been replaced by a lady, Hashimoto-san. But they came out with, their plan for how they would make the Tokyo Olympics safe and successful. And not only is it truly Kafkaesque, but you hear some of the key points you can read for yourself. But the point that struck me and that I want to highlight is, okay, vaccines are not mandatory. I think they couldn't have done it otherwise, because they would have basically disallowed some countries from participating, right? Because there are still countries that don't have any vaccine, right? But what I thought was really subtle and but interesting is that they said they would encourage, of course, vaccinations of all participants, whether sports people or support. And the IOC said they would help facilitate delegations from lower income countries to obtain vaccines. Now that is truly amazing. That is a form of corruption, basically, because you're here potentially offering vaccine to people who in almost all cases don't need it, right? I mean, there may be a few functionaries who are above 65 or so, or who have some precondition, but the vast majority of these people we're talking about are extremely healthy sports people. And they are about the last people who need a vaccine, right? So if these countries are struggling to even give a vaccine to those who really need it, and you then give it to someone else who doesn't really need it just because you're organizing some games. And I'm not against organizing the games, don't get me wrong. I would just not connect it in any way to vaccinations. But then you're potentially killing people, right? Because you have vaccine and you're not giving it immediately to those people who you know need it most, right? That's a form of murder, right? And it's also a form of corruption. It's like, oh, we want everybody to participate in our system, in our Olympics, and we do what it takes, yeah, including the things that are obviously unethical, right? So I thought that was very striking, but not to hit too hard on the IOC. They're no worse than lots of other organizations and lobbying groups, and I will revert back to that in a moment. But this is the type of thing. I got this on the BBC, and they say this without breaking into any sweat. Yeah, we will basically favor some people over others, right? Some animals are more equal than others, and we have no qualms at all to say that aloud, right? And hey, we're the Olympic Committee, everybody should participate, we are all equal. No, we are not all equal if you give the vaccine to people who don't actually need them, right? And not to the ones who are waiting for them. But anyway, so it's just one example of very, very many, a striking one, I thought. Okay, next, and in relation to this, I went back to my October and November presentations to pull out this, chart. Some of you may remember, state of exception, right? There I was talking about how almost all nations in the world have basically torn apart their basic rights in their country for their citizens, right? It's called a state of exception. One of the things I highlighted was mandatory vaccinations. And I had said, they may not de jure make them mandatory, but they will de facto make them mandatory by basically telling you, if you haven't been vaccinated, you're not allowed to do this and this and this, right? And I think we are seeing that now. The EU is pondering a vaccination pass that will then allow you to be considered human being. And if you don't have the vaccination pass, you're not considered a human being. And I also highlighted this question of discrimination at that time. And that's, again, with this vaccination passport, as long as not everybody has been able to receive the vaccine, even if they want it, there will be discrimination. If you have anything like a vaccination passport and any kind of requirement of any form to say you can only do this, or go here or go there, if you have a vaccination passport or some way of proving that you've been vaccinating, then that is blatant discrimination, utterly against any spirits of any basic laws in any normal countries, right? So all of this is completely illegal, as well as being completely unethical. But that's apparently where we're heading. So I'm calling the EU's vaccine passport scheme, and it's not just the EU, others are also working on this, the world's biggest discrimination and corruption scheme. Guess what? I mean, whoever can pay for it, or who has connections, or who is a VIP will, of course, get their vaccination passport when they want it, right? And everybody else will not, or slowly, maybe. Yeah. I mean, if there was ever a scheme that opens the door for corruption, then this is it, right? I mean, there's never been anything like this before, especially if it becomes a global phenomenon, right? This will take corruption and discrimination to a level that I think nobody could have, until a year ago, nobody could have imagined possible, right? And all of us who are saying, yeah, I'm going to take the vaccine, not because I need it, no, because 99% of us, remember, don't need it, but because if I don't take it, I'm not treated like a human being, right? And I want to be treated like a human being, and I want my basic rights back, right? And apparently, the only way to do that is to get vaccinated, right? So, but then we are participating in that corruption precisely. So all of us, 7.8 billion people, are endorsing if we go and say, I'm going to get vaccinated just because of this scheme, even though I know I don't, and normally I wouldn't want to be vaccinated because I know I don't need it, and there's no point to it, but I will do it anyways because of the scheme. Then we're all, in a way, contributing to that scheme. So will I. As soon as, in Singapore, that may take many months, but as soon as I can get the vaccine, surely I will take it, because without the vaccine, possibly I cannot travel anywhere, right, freely. So I will participate in the corruption as well. I'm just pointing out that's what it is. Right? As you know, I like to name things what they actually are, right? Which is something that in the media people don't do. Here's the discrimination. Okay, next. Next was, I thought this was interesting. This came out today, actually, also on the BBC. Actually, it came on the TV program in the morning in my time, and then I looked it up online. And there are five points to it, and I pasted them all into my little presentation because they're all kind of interesting. So point number one they made was single shot reduces hospitalization risk by 80%. That's clearly good news. I would just point out that that's not exactly new news, right? That was totally to be expected. And I would have thought it would be over 90% or so, but okay, 80% is not bad. So I'm happy enough with that. It does reinforce the UK strategy to give an initial shot first to as many people as possible and delay the second shot beyond the 3 or 4 weeks that the manufacturers had recommended. That probably has been a smart move because this data endorses that it was a smart move, right? As a sideline, I should say that last time I made fun of the Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, for sneaking in a vaccine that had been tested only on people who don't really need it, right, below 60 or something like that, or below 65. But I have to say that was very clever, and I don't know whether he actively lobbied the manufacturers or the regulator, maybe more than the manufacturer, to let this pass, or whether they just did it this way and then he jumped onto the sort of the opportunity. But he, at a minimum, he was smart enough to see that, hey, if the thing is tested only on people between 18 and 60, of course, in that age group, any kind of risks, side effects, which will inevitably here and there happen, right? Very little, but they do happen, are minimized compared to the elderly. And with a younger one, probably not minimized, but if a younger one got some side issue, you would have a bigger outcry. So to test the thing on people between 18 and 60, the risk of something sort of going wrong in the testing that delays you is minimized. It's the lowest of all age groups, probably, right? At least psychologically, right? Certainly with the elderly, you would expect more side effects. And every side effect then needs to be investigated, and it needs to be excluded that really has something to do with the vaccine and so which means every time it delays the admission of the vaccine. Right? So either the British regulator or the British government, or the two of them in collaboration, or the two of them plus the manufacturer in collaboration, have been very clever, saying we test the thing on those people where it's least likely to get into any trouble, and therefore get it approved as fast as possible. And once it's approved, the government just makes an executive decision to say, we will give it to the above 65-year-olds anyways, right? So that was, in retrospect, I would say unethical if you want to adhere to your normal procedures, but it saves lives. So here you have an unethical but maybe acceptable move because it saves lives, and it was always predictable that the thing is harmless, right? This vaccine, right? In almost all cases, there are always some exceptions, right? But the virus is harmless, as I've been saying many times, and the vaccine is sort of either a dead version of the virus, or I forgot which one AstraZeneca does, or it's the RNA or a part of the RNA of the virus, or some other fragment or other sort of characteristic of the virus that can be reproduced and then given to people. Right? I mean, given that the virus itself is so harmless, there was never a great likelihood that this vaccine would be dangerous. I mean, there may be some stuff in the vaccine that isn't the virus itself, but some liquid that it's transported in and kept in and so on and so forth. I don't know anything about manufacturing of vaccines, but it was always likely that, because this is such a simple, straightforward virus, that we would get the vaccines, although we didn't know how quickly. And I personally didn't think they would be there quite as quickly as they were, like December. But it was always likely we'll get them. It's no surprise that we now have like dozens of manufacturers who are either already approved or who will get approved, and it's will be manufactured in a matter of a few months. Will be swarmed with vaccination material, and even the Chinese don't publicate their data, and the Russians, we don't want to trust them either. But take the stuff because it's bound to be harmless, right? Because remember, all it has to do is encourage your immune system to produce the type of antibody that prevents the virus from migrating down into the lung, right? And as I said before, 99% of us, our immune systems do that anyways, speedily enough before the virus ever gets down there. In 1% of the cases, mostly elderly, it takes too long. The immune system is too slow. Antibodies don't get produced fast enough, and the virus migrates on, where it can do damage down here, right? So all the vaccine has to do is prepare the immune system, to start producing those antibodies that just prevent the virus. They don't even have to kill the virus completely. They just sort of have to do enough so that the virus doesn't get any further than your upper respiratory system. That, as a complete layman, I would say that's a really simple brief insofar as vaccinations are concerned, right? At least to me as a layperson, that sounds like a pretty simple, straightforward kind of brief. But that's all the vaccine has to do, and it does. So all we are learning now, it does. And one shot is actually almost enough, but if the second shot takes you from 80% to 95% or so, sure, in an ideal world, you would want to give that second shot to people, but obviously it's more important to give a first shot to all the people who require it, and then of course give them the second shot as well. And maybe there is a time span. If it's too long between the first and the second, then maybe the second one will not have a lot of effect, and then it's almost wasted. So there's maybe an optimal kind of distribution that the experts can probably figure out. But so the BBC is celebrating this, and that's understandable. But this was totally to be expected, right? And it's completely in line with what I've been saying about the virus for the last 12 months, which is it's a very simple, straightforward, harmless in itself, common cold coronavirus, right? And and it would be exactly reacting like this, that all it needs is a bit of a kick for your immune system to start doing the production of these antibodies. And if there are a few there, it will not necessarily prevent you from the infection per se, but it just needs to be enough to prevent the virus from getting further down, right? And obviously it does, at least in 80% of the cases, which is really not bad at all, right? Now, in an ideal world, you would want it to be 100% of cases, but 80% is not bad. But I had thought it might be actually 90, as I say. But so in other words, these people will still benefit from the second shot, and they should get it, of course. But what this means is that fatalities in the UK and the US and those places who have really started to massively roll out vaccination programs, fatalities are going to start dropping very quickly. I think we're not seeing that much of that yet in the data I will present to you today, but in a month from now, I think we should see a very significant drop-off in fatalities in those countries that have significant vaccination programs ongoing. Now that will mix up in the Northern Hemisphere with the end of the cold season. So anyways, the fatalities would be coming down next month. They're already coming down now, and they will, they would even more so, next month. So it will be difficult to separate the impact of the vaccines from the impact of just the seasonal shift. But I have no doubt now that given that this is now confirmed here, that there will be a significant drop-off in fatalities in those countries that are rolling out even a single shot strategy like Britain or a double shot strategy like the US. They will have significant impact. All of which is, in a way, good news. What I liked about this particular point is that I really think is the good news here is that they're starting to talk about hospitalizations. Remember last time I said a lot of governments are talking about killing the virus, stopping the virus, being at war with the virus, and which is not the target, right? And they're talking about, herd immunity and everybody has to be vaccinated. I mean, eventually it doesn't really do any harm to vaccinate the people. As I said, the vaccination is harmless. It doesn't do any good either. So I'm quite neutral on that, as long as it doesn't delay the end to the restrictions of our basic rights. That's the problem, really, right? But otherwise, I'm neutral whether people get vaccinated or not, because I think either way, it doesn't matter in almost all cases. It just makes no difference. But it's good to see they're starting, even in the BBC, which has been, like many media, very slow to start understanding what this is. They are talking about hospitalizations now, and no longer. They're not talking here about, it will slow down the virus, or it will prevent you from getting an infection, all those irrelevant goals, which, because they're irrelevant, cannot possibly really be goals, right? A goal always has to have a relevance, otherwise it's not a goal, right? So these are irrelevant things. They're at least starting to talk about the relevant things. So someone in the UK, I mean, the reporters are just sort of repeating what they hear, right? They don't add any kind of layer of intelligence to it normally, right? But whoever they're hearing this from must have understood that it's all about the hospitalizations, right? Because a hospitalization means the virus has gotten into the lung, means there's a real risk, right? So that's what is to prevent it. So hospitalization, as you know, I've been using hospitalization as a metric for, severe disease, meaning who is really sick. My definition, as you know, for many months has been sick is he who has to be hospitalized, right? And that's a slight simplification, as I said before, because some people never get hospitalized even though they should. And there are certainly also people who do get hospitalized, like Mr. Trump, who didn't need it, but, VIP treatment, or in some cases, misdiagnosis or care, just extra caution. And I don't mean to critique that too much, because these things are just bound to happen. So I'm just saying to use hospitalization as a metric for severe disease is not 100% perfect. I know that, right? But it's the best metric I had, and that I could actually get data on, right? So now they are starting to talk about hospitalization being really what needs to be minimized. So that's good. Don't know why 12 months ago people didn't say that. In fact, if you remember, at the very beginning in March, the politicians did talk about that. They said we need to protect our healthcare system, which is the wrong way around in a way, but it comes to the same thing, right? Which means we need to minimize hospitalizations, right? Or add capacity, right? So they've gone full circle. For 12 months, they have been terrorizing the whole world. And now they're coming back to say, yeah, actually, it's just about not having those hospitalizations, that we can prevent them. And we could have prevented many of them in the last 12 months. As I've said before, giving masks to those people who actually really need them, self-testing equipment. I've talked about all of this. Oh yeah, Germany last week approved the self-testing equipment that people can use at home. That was last week, at the end of February 2021. And you go, well, why didn't they approve this in the first week of March 2020, right? 1 year earlier, right? Now you may say, they didn't have it yet and it needs to be developed, but it doesn't take 12 months to develop a self-test. I mean, come on, right? They are totally behind the curve. It's almost like too late. Nobody will want that stuff anymore now that we have vaccines, right? 12 months ago, that could have really saved a lot of lives, right? Because you could have surrounded the elderly with all these gimmicks, those technical solutions to protect them, right? But we didn't, right? We didn't protect our elderly. And now that the vaccines are coming, now all of a sudden, you can have your self-test equipment. Yeah, but nobody needs it anymore. Hello. But anyway, so long story, but I'm glad that people here are talking about, it prevents hospitalization, because that's precisely why we need the vaccines. And apparently some people have finally understood that. Now, I hold my breath. There may be lots of governments in the world who either don't understand this or don't want to understand this, right? But at least in Britain, I think they do understand this now, and I sure hope that the EU will follow. I mean, you may know that the EU has refused to endorse this AstraZeneca vaccine for those above 60 or 65 because it wasn't tested on them. And I understand that from an ethical point of view or from a procedural point of view, but frankly, that's stupid, because I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that giving the stuff to them will save lives and makes them safer than not giving the stuff to them, right? I mean, it's always better to give them this vaccine, even if it hasn't tested on their age group, than not give it to them, because they're exactly the ones they're trying to protect, remember? So I only hope that the EU will, now that they get this, and as I say, I mean, this is totally expected, but yeah, our dear leaders always need empirical evidence first, because they don't trust thinking, right? Because thinking would have told you exactly this before, but okay, now we have the empirical evidence, which is great. Then hopefully the EU will now go and say, okay, if we withhold this medicine or this vaccine from our elderly, we are murderers, right? So I don't know how many people really want to be a murderer. I don't think they consciously want to be a murderer, but if you withhold this vaccine from the elderly and have no other vaccine to give those elderly, then you are a murderer, because some people will die. Some unknown number of people will die because you haven't given them the vaccine that you actually have at your fingertips. So, so this is good news, especially if it triggers a bit of thinking, a mini portion of thinking in the rest of the world. So it seems to me the UK is ahead of the game in terms of actually starting to understand what this whole thing is actually about, at least to some degree. Now, to some degree, I should say, because item number 2, PM defends border control measures. Yes, great, Mr. Johnson. Not only are the basic rights not being restored, but with this kind of thinking, there are some new strains or some new mutations out there, and we as long as we don't know them and whether they react well to the vaccine, and or they don't react to the vaccine, the immune system reacts to the vaccine, but whether the immune system, thanks to the vaccine, then can deal with this new mutant as well as with the previous. As long as we don't know that, we will continue to lock down our borders and clamp down on people, and I don't know whether this guy, this prime minister, understands that this virus is here to stay, and it will continue mutating, and there will be endless numbers of mutations eventually. I mean, does he really propose every time to close the borders? Really? It's nonsense, right? It's nonsense. I mean, apart from the fact, as I said before, that every mutation is actually likely to be less harmful, if anything, or certainly not more harmful in the sense of getting into our lung. The virus has no interest in getting our lung. Right? Once you've given a shot, a single shot, to those people who are so-called risk groups, you can throw any variant of this virus at them probably, and they will all, their immune system will be able, in all likelihood, and I cannot guarantee this, right? But it's very logical that this trigger alone will probably suffice for them have enough stimulation to the immune system to be able to deal with variations of this virus. I mean, unless it's a variation that is so different, like we have in influenza, that it is really like a new virus, right? That can happen and probably will happen. But so far, all the mutations we've seen, I don't think that any of them are like that. And remember, influenza has been with us for forever. And at the moment, we have 4, if I'm correctly informed, we have 4 strains, right? And I mean, this doesn't happen like every month that there's a new influenza strain that is so different that it requires a whole new vaccine, or that the risk arises that immune systems again will fail, right? It will happen, but not at this kind of a frequency, right? So to throw a tantrum every time some mutant pops up is nonsense. Right? We have to trust in our immune systems, and if there is a new mutant or a new strain that is so different that there's a real risk that our immune systems, even though they've been trained on the previous version, no longer work with this one, at least for those 1% who have problems with their immune system, then we can go and say, now let's fine tune our vaccines or redevelop the vaccine. And we know how to do it now. And I mean, the second time will be even quicker, right? It will be a matter of weeks maybe. But you can't every time when a new mutant comes, oh, we lock our borders. I mean, what kind of world does Mr. Johnson propose to want to live in? I ask him. Okay. Next point. Teachers risk similar to other, yeah, this is brilliant, right? BBC is making a big point out of this, right? Teachers' risk is similar to other under 65s. Yeah, of course. Why does anybody propose that teachers have a different immune system? I mean, some of these things. Now you may say, yeah, but they were worried maybe that teachers interact a lot with young people, and they therefore may get more easily exposed to the virus. Many people interact with many people in their professions, not only teachers. So I've never understood why schools and teachers are even a topic of discussion. Yeah? We know that for children, the virus is completely harmless. And yeah, for teachers, if they are like elderly teachers over 60, 65, you might say, well, maybe they should wear a mask, or, you know, maybe we need to find a way to help them and protect them if they are at risk, right? But I mean, the vast majority of teachers aren't above 65. All the teachers I used to know, they all retired early. They're civil servants, right? They retired like 58 or something. So none of them is at risk. I mean, it's very few exceptions. So I just never understood this. And this is so hilarious, right? Oh, teachers' risk is similar to, yeah, of course it is. But this warrants a headline in the BBC, you know? That's interesting. Now, the Download Festival, I don't know what that is, but it's obviously a festival for music also, has been cancelled. It has been cancelled because of the pandemic. No, and I said this many times before, nothing gets cancelled because of the pandemic. Things get cancelled because of human stupidity. Right? There is no pandemic. I've said that many times before. 2, if you want to protect people, you just tell them, look, there is a festival here. If you feel at risk, don't go. I mean, it's so simple, right? If someone, you know, is elderly or has some preconditions, I really don't feel like going to this festival at the moment, given you know the virus. Well, then don't go. I really don't get it. I mean, this is something that any adult can decide for themselves, right? You don't need anything to do on the part of the government, nothing. Right? I mean, we've known now for at least 9 or 10 months that this virus, unlike the so-called SARS-1, doesn't depend very heavily on super spreader events. It does sometimes create super spreader events. So yes, if you have this kind of crowd like this, there may well be some spreading going on. But you know, the virus spreads anyways, whether you allow or not allow these events. I've said that many times, right? I mean, there's really no point not having these events. The only thing you have to do is, protect the vulnerable, and the only thing there you have to do is tell them, look, there's a certain risk. Here's a statistic, probability X, Y, Z that I get infected, and B, if you get infected, then you might get sick, right? And if you do get sick, you might die, right? And there's a certain probability to all these three steps that can be, I mean, it's not difficult to figure that out and make it transparent, right? And then every adult person by themselves can say, oh, maybe this year I skip it, right? Yeah, but we are not treated like adults. So, new mom holds baby for the first time. Now that's a very touching story. I mean, one thing I really liked about this particular part of the article is that being diagnosed with COVID-19, which is this murky, what does that even mean to be diagnosed with COVID-19? I bet you almost nobody has a clear definition of what that means. But it's here specifically associated with pneumonia, right? And as I've said many times, in almost all cases, when we say if someone has COVID-19, we probably mean he or she has pneumonia, right? In almost all cases, there may be a few other things that can happen other than pneumonia, and I'm not deep expert on this, but in almost all cases, when the people get really sick, they have pneumonia, right? So it's kind of nice that at least the BBC, although they do it in a really indirect and subtle way, they're not saying COVID-19 meaning they have pneumonia. They don't equal them, and they may be not exactly equal. But they say, well, in this particular case, at least, of this lady, she did have pneumonia. Yeah? And so in the same sentence, almost, they associate COVID-19 with pneumonia. Again, I think the BBC reporters are making some progress in terms of starting to understand. I don't know why it takes 12 months, but that's good news. However, then they talk about the woman needed life-saving treatment. Now, what the hell is that? And more importantly, whatever that is, yeah, but was that associated with her having COVID and having pneumonia, or was it just associated with any significantly premature birth? And I take it that 10 weeks is fairly significant. I take it, I'm not expert on that, may need this kind of treatment. I mean, they should be very clear. Did the woman need anything specific because of her pneumonia? Meaning, for example, did she need to be put on a ventilator? Or what do they mean here, right? Because this kind of thing, this lack of clarity about what life-saving treatment, like what? Because of her premature birth or because of her pneumonia? I mean, we want to know that, because they put something here in connection with COVID-19 where it's not clear, is it actually connected to the COVID-19? I mean, into pneumonia, or is it just standard procedure when someone has a 10-week early baby, then you do certain things. It's not clear to me. Similarly, baby Leo was put on a ventilator. Well, again, is it put on a ventilator because it's 10 weeks premature, or is there any kind of suggestion that premature birth babies could be at risk of catching this pneumonia? I mean, it's not, I mean, I would like to know, right? I mean, that would be interesting, but unfortunately, this article is in that sense extremely murky, right? I mean, you really learn very little what's actually the case, right? And someone like me who actually likes to understand it is a bit frustrating. Yeah? But again, at least they're associating COVID-19 with pneumonia. That to me is a little, reason to celebrate. Okay, that was BBC. Now, today on the channel News Asia, which is a local Singaporean channel, and I sort of saw it in passing, and so I didn't fully pay attention, and then afterwards I couldn't find it online. But someone in China apparently, if I understood correctly, is suggesting that Chinese borders with the US could be opened by September or so, provided, one, cases in China remain extremely low as at present. Number two, provided 90% of the US population has been vaccinated. Now that's really funny. First of all, nobody believes that the cases in China are this low, right? So they're talking about, I mean, something that is totally uncredible, right? And secondly, they're seriously saying, oh, the condition is that 90% of the US population have been vaccinated. Well, people in China, maybe you should realize in the US, you cannot just simply go and vaccinate people. Well, the US is not China, where you probably can. And you get to 90% of the population, on a voluntary basis. I mean, even if it's de facto mandatory, as I said earlier, there will be people in the US who will just say, I don't need the vaccination passport because I don't travel, I don't. Or there will be people who say, I reject any kind of vaccination, and I don't want it, right? I'm scared of it, or what have you. So, again, I don't know who said this and how exactly it was said, but this is the kind of situation where you think, oh, is China now looking to export its totalitarian regime to the rest of the world? Are they really suggesting, because of a common cold virus, now the United States has to throw overboard, 250 years of values, such as individual freedom to choose whether you are vaccinated or not, just so that the borders with China can be opened? This is interesting, because depending on who said this, they may mean it seriously, right? I mean, China is asserting itself, and they may be thinking now the world has to become like China. Yeah. So we'll all be, ants or something like that, right? Like the people in China, right? I'm not sure that will happen, but it's scary. It's scary that this is even on the agenda and publicly set, right? I mean, that is really, I mean, we are seeing before our eyes the so-called Asian century evolving. And Asian century basically means totalitarianism, at least in the Chinese fashion, right? Totalitarian regimes to encompass the entire globe, right? I think that seems to be, if not a vision that has been explicitly laid out, but implicitly in the back of people's minds, someone must have said something like this. Otherwise, the Channel News Asia probably wouldn't have said so. I would be curious to know, maybe it's a very junior functionary somewhere in the Communist Party of China, but this mindset that is sort of reflected in these kinds of ideas, such as, if China says we have no cases, then the rest of the world must believe that. No. Or if we wanted, then 90% of the US population will have to be vaccinated, otherwise we won't let them into our country. This is the sign of things to come, and that's why I'm highlighting this. Let's see where it goes, but this is where we are heading, right? Another point I wanted to make, I didn't bring any kind of article here, but there are lots of articles at the moment, lots of corporate offers and so on around the topic of resilience, and also individual, training and coaching programs around resilience. And of course, I understand that people in lockdown situations, they need advice, they need counsel, they need support, and resilience, can help on the individual level, right? But I've seen so much of it recently that I'm getting a little bit worried that this whole idea of resilience is basically the new soma. And if you don't know what soma is, it's a tranquilizer in the novel Brave New World, where the whole population is basically brainwashed and tranquilized with the help of this soma, which is some pharmaceutical, I guess. So resilience is not a pharmaceutical, it's a concept, but it can serve in the same way. It can make everybody compliant. I'm anyways very surprised that there's so few voices speaking up against government policies around the world, right? But if we then prescribe people, resilience. The resilience is sort of maybe very stoic, right? It's like, yeah, we'll just accept, hit me, and I'll just accept it, right? I think that is dangerous. So maybe these are the, the well-known wise monkeys, ancient Asian tradition, right? The ones depicted here actually belong to Mahatma Gandhi in his garden. And they usually are interpreted to mean see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil, which to me sounds a bit like a tranquilizer kind of proposition. And so my interpretation of that is don't breathe, don't think, don't move, shut up, right? So that's a bit boring. Yeah. If people really think like that, oh, I need to stay put at home, locked down, and practice resilience. That scares me. Nothing against resilience. All of us should have that. I agree with that. But to make that the center point of your life proposition, your life strategy, I find that very, very scary. Okay, someone sent me this in German, this is from Germany, from a newspaper there. They did a quick survey online. 30,000 people participated. Would you want to be vaccinated with the, would you agree to be vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine? 53% said no. 40% said yes. 7% don't know or whatever. So the majority said no. Now, given what we saw earlier from the BBC, 80% actually reduction in hospitalizations. I think when people see that data, maybe they'll change their mind. So maybe this newspaper should repeat the same question again with a bit more information. But and then maybe it will swing the other way. So this is maybe already outdated. But what it did when I received this from my friend, it triggered me, and I said, my first reaction was, why, if they have this tool, right, this online, simple, live, you can choose or vote kind of tool. I said to my friend, why wouldn't they use it for more relevant questions, right? Rather than this kind of, which is basically, as we now know for sure, but we already kind of suspected, irrelevant, right? Yes, of course they should take AstraZeneca vaccine if it's offered to them, even if they don't think they need it, because they will need it to, do their summer vacation this year. So I think that's already settled, right? But I said, why wouldn't this newspaper, which is a very respectable newspaper in Germany, why wouldn't they ask some more relevant questions? And so I sent my friend a little catalog, and this was like shooting from the hip, right? Just by WhatsApp, in German. So here's my translation. Why don't they ask people, do you want to be patronized by the state? Do you agree with the current indefinite suspension of basic rights? Do you feel it's right that 100% of humanity are held hostage because 1% of humanity live with compromised immune systems, right? Do you accept that any opportunity to show solidarity that you could have had by, for example, voluntarily wearing a mask when you meet elderly or whatever, has been taken away from you by the government's mandating all of these things? So taking any voluntary, free choice away. I said this before, if you don't have a free choice, you cannot be showing solidarity at all. So we are completely, utterly unsolidarian, that's the word, society at the moment, thanks to our government. Dear Grandma, do you like it that out of consideration for your health, sorry for the typos, for the past 12 months, children who are known not to be affected by COVID have not been able to go to school, go to kindergarten, go to their creche, not been able to play normally, pursue their hobbies, pursue their normal social contact, exercise and play sports normally, or even show their face in public because I have to put a mask on top of it. All of this, dear grandmother, out of consideration for your health. Do you like that? I've said this before. Why don't we ask some of the grandmas whether they actually like this, right? I mean, I can't see that anybody would actually want this, right? So, but we're doing it. Do you endorse the federal president? This is the federal president, head of state of Federal Republic of Germany, who in some talk declared war on the virus. You know, do you agree with Germany being at war with apparently a formal war declaration against the common cold virus, right? Do you agree with that? Do you agree with the World Health Organization being assigned the right to call out a pandemic? They call this pandemic, right? Even where by any conventional definition of a pandemic, we are not in such a situation. I said this before, this is not a pandemic by the conventional definition, which is basically a significant proportion of a population falling ill, which is not the case. 1% are falling ill of worldwide of all people infected, 1%. That's not a significant proportion, that's an insignificant proportion, right? So it's not a pandemic. Right? And we can argue forever whether it is a pandemic or not, or we could say, oh, but then maybe the definition is why we have to change it. But I'm more questioning, and I'm asking people here, do you really think it's right that the World Health Organization, which is under no controls, can simply go and say there's a pandemic, and then our governments, who should be under control, but they then immediately step out of control and run out of control, and then go, oh, we have a pandemic, therefore we can suspend all basic rights in our country, right? I mean, do you people agree with that? Which is what happened last year, right? Do you people agree with that? I mean, why doesn't the newspaper, and I know that my questions are all tendential, and I know all of that, right? They're deliberately so, right? One could phrase this a little bit more neutrally, I'm sure. I didn't do that effort. But these are the relevant questions we should ask our citizens. Do you really agree with all this, right? But instead we're asking, would you take the AstraZeneca if you were offered? Yeah, I think that, as I say, that's now irrelevant. But here I continue to my friend with my thingy, right? How would you like to be treated? A, like an adult, B, like a child, C, like cattle. Virtually nobody on this planet right now is being treated like an adult. If you're very lucky, you're in a country where you're treated like a child. If you're not so lucky, possibly the majority of the global population is currently being treated like cattle. Do you like that? Do you feel it's acceptable that 12 months after the occurrence of the virus, public broadcasters still equate and randomly mix up an infection with the common cold virus and a severe pneumonia? Remember, I've talked about this before, right? Oh, so-and-so has been tested, Trump has been tested positive with COVID. COVID is a severe pneumonia, yeah? No, he hasn't been tested because you can't actually test positive for pneumonia. So you know what I mean, right? I mean, why don't they ask people whether they think it's acceptable that our media tell us bullshit 99 out of 100 times? And as I said earlier, BBC is getting a little bit better, maybe it's not 1%, but maybe they're 10% of where they could be in terms of performance, being truthful and relevant. Yeah, they're making progress, but slow, right? And maybe the BBC is better than others, right? So is it acceptable that, I mean, people talk about, we have to combat misinformation. 99.9% of all misinformation about this are coming from governments. Yeah. Is that okay? What do you think about governments basing their decisions, as Frau Merkel likes to say many times? We're basing our decisions on scientific evidence. Yeah, scientific evidence takes many months, if not years, sometimes many years, to actually gather. So, do you agree that your policymakers wait for years until the scientists have provided them with the scientific evidence? Or by maybe alternative, do you agree that maybe thinking could be also part of the policy mix? Yeah, a little bit of thinking. Do you find it acceptable? Thinking up to now has not been one of the resources deployed by the federal government of Germany. Lots of scientific advice, but no thinking. Do you find it acceptable that an old-fashioned pneumonia, which is what it is, has been classified without any reservation by some obscure experts, maybe in the World Health Organization, or maybe somewhere else, I don't know, as a novel disease with a dangerous sounding name, COVID-19, as if they wanted to add some kind of Hollywood-style horror factor to it? This is just a pneumonia. And yeah, pneumonia can be fatal. Absolutely. Has been the case since the dawn of humankind, right? But it's not new, right? And I said this before, maybe it deserves its own scientific name. That may well be the case, because maybe there are many, many, many different ways of having pneumonia, and they're all a little bit different. I don't mean to argue with the experts about whether, the taxonomists, whether they should give this a specific name. I'm talking about how these kinds of names then have a life on their own and scare people to hell, and apparently disable them from thinking about the whole thing, right? COVID, it's a pneumonia, right? Why don't you say so if it is so? Anyway, so yeah, this is almost my last point on this run. So today I saw that the nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize have come in. There was a deadline. I thought it was interesting because, of course, I looked up whether Stefan Löfven and Anders Tegnell would be among the candidates, who, in my book, would be the obvious winners of the Nobel Peace Prize this year. They are not mentioned here, but there are 300 something candidates, so maybe they are, but they're not mentioned here. These are the last men standing when it comes to defending democracy. So those of you who have heard of democracy, you have heard of democracy? Yeah. Well, these are the last defenders of democracy. They are now toppling, and it would have been nice to have given them the Nobel Peace Prize and then discontinued the Nobel Peace Prize, because I don't think, and I speak about that in a moment, I don't think humanity continues to exist in the way we knew it, and I don't think we need Nobel Peace Prizes in the future. So this would, in my book, would be the last one, and I would give it to Stefan Löfven and Anders Tegnell for their very last stand on defending democracy, which is now dead. I was struck that the article says a vast group of people can nominate. No, this is a very, very narrow group of people. Apparently, I'm not one of those who can nominate. I thought that was really interesting. Vast group of people, politicians, university professors, directors of foreign policy institute, past recipients. That's a tiny group. That's a few thousand people. There are 7.8 billion people on this planet, and anybody should be able to nominate anybody. I was struck by this. I thought it was really funny. So this Nobel Peace Prize is obviously worth nothing. Right? I mean, there's a good chance that not a single person who submitted anything here can think. Right? There's a very good chance, given that there's so few people who can think. I mean, at least we should open it to 7.8 billion people. So maybe there are some among them who actually think, right? Who should get a Nobel Peace Prize, right? But yeah, obviously it's a very elite, select group who are even empowered to nominate. Which was, I mean, I didn't know that, but now having seen that, I thought, okay, then this prize is obviously worth nothing, right? Zero, right? I mean, it's worth $1 million or something equivalent to the winner, and I grant them that. Please. I mean, it's not that I, sort of don't grant them the nice prize, but the prize is worthless if it's not open. Right? It's some kind of elite self-patting on the back kind of prize. All right, but I thought it was really fascinating when I went down and said, well, who are the nominees that they're mentioning? I mean, this is so Löfven and Tegnell are not among them, but Jared Kushner This is some relation of Trump. And if you recall, he is the guy who masterminded that scheme whereby the Israeli terror against the Palestinians for the last 70 years becomes legitimized. So it's a scheme that legitimizes terror. And worse, it opens the door for this terror to continue in the future indefinitely, until the Israelis have stolen the last little bit of land, completed the ethnic cleaning of the Palestinians, and basically abolished Palestine. Right? So this is Jared Kushner, and they are proposing him here for the Peace Prize. I think that's I mean it is a certain type of peace when you completely eliminate any opposition, then there's peace. That's a great. That's very peaceful. Just eliminate the Palestinians, and there will be peace. I love this. Yeah. So I strongly recommend to the committee to consider Mr. Jared Kushner. Since, as I say, this is a worthless prize, and also it ought to be the last one because humanity has self-abolished in the meantime. Why not give it to someone like Kushner? I mean, that would be that. I mean, for someone like me who likes irony and likes to make fun of things, actually, that would be very fitting. Right? It would completely then devalue all the other Nobel Peace Prizes ever handed out, right? And I think that would be just the right gesture because, as I say, I think they are given that they're not even open to nomination. They have no value anyway. So we may as well demonstrate that by making someone like Jared Kushner, the guy. Right? And I don't know this guy, and I have no personal grudges against this guy other than he's obviously a supporter of terrorism. I don't know whether I should approve of that. I don't think so. But other than that, I have no. I don't know the guy, right? But he is one of the shining lights of supporting terrorism in this world, namely the terror of the Israelis against the Palestinians, and that may well be a deserving, a deserving position to be in to get this prize. But the other one here that is really interesting, World Health Organization. Now that's a real good one, right? I mean, the most dysfunctional organization that human beings have ever created, that did more than anybody else probably to get us into this mess. Let's give them a Peace Prize. Well, I mean, they have made sure that billions of people get locked down at home, right? And are very peaceful. I mean, I'm very peaceful here, locked down at home. Yeah. So yeah, maybe they deserve the Peace Prize. So I hope it can be given to Mr. Kushner and the World Health Organization. They can split it maybe. Yeah. I think that would be a very nice way to end humanity. So I had to think of when thinking about all these things that I just quoted to you. There must be method in this madness, right? As Shakespeare said very, very nicely. It's very powerful. So this be madness, yet that there's method to it. Absolutely, yeah. And I've tried to think what is it that is maybe not method but systematic about it. And I had to think again of the graphic I shared 1 or 2 months ago. The Uncanny Valley, if you remember that curve where if a machine and sort of android becomes ever more human-like, first people warm up to it, and then there comes a point when it comes too close to being human, but it isn't human, where they really dislike it, and that's this kind of where it's really uncanny to them, this android, and they don't take to it at all. They are afraid of it. Nauseated by it, right? And that's the so-called Uncanny Valley. And so I took that graphic again. Here, you may recognize it from last time. And I'm abusing that graphic for something else now. So it's no longer about what I just explained, what it originally is about, but the graphic itself, the curve, I thought is useful. And I thought, well, if you think about, the development of humanity since prehistory up to the industrial age, I think there has generally in many cultures, not only in Europe, I'm European, so I have probably that kind of baggage, right? But I mean, I think in any society around the world, there has been this sense of a gradual, becoming more human, becoming more civilized, some notion of progression, some notion of we are becoming ever more human. We're getting ever closer to fulfilling our destiny as human beings, right? And there has been a strong tendency also, for example, in all the major religions, to put humans aside from animals and say, yeah, biologically we may be animal, but we are not animal, we are human, we are different, right? We are not just quantitatively different, but we are qualitatively different. We are a different category. We are human. We are closer to God, or we are in between God and animal, right? But we are a special case. That I think that is quite common across cultures and religions. And in Europe, it's developed through like antiquity and then modernity, by which I mean the Renaissance and the Reformation and humanism, and then the Enlightenment in the 17th, 18th century, right? Those were the sort of the main stages of this development. Initially, it was Christianity, then it went beyond Christianity, and it became increasingly rationalized. But the thinkers of different ages, they all more or less shared the view that humans are different, and we are evolving and progressing towards something higher. And in the 19th century, one of my favorite philosophers, Nietzsche, said humans have. He was an optimist. He was a very affirmative person, and he wanted to affirm humanity. And he had this concept of what he called the Overman. And he said, humans have not yet reached the state where we have fully fulfilled our potential. We have this potential residing in us to become something even more special and greater, right? And he called that potential in us the Overman. So he said, ultimately, that's where we should be going. We should exceed ourselves and become more than just human. And he defined this Overman as someone who fully affirms life in its entire richness, who can actively create their own new values, who can posit themselves as a subject, meaning they define themselves and the world around them by themselves rather than depending on any kind of traditions or religions or other schemes that put things in stone. Right? It's a continuous self-creation of all human beings out of themselves. Right? And there are people who embrace conflict, they take risks, they're not afraid of things, rather they affirm life as it is, including death. That's maybe an important point. Death being part of life, and the Overman embraces that. It is so, right? And it must be so. Now, Nietzsche, and I'm putting words into his mouth, he didn't say it this way. This is sort of my back of the envelope kind of interpretation of the Overman. Right? But he then also said, well, unfortunately, we seem to be pretty far away from that. And he created a kind of a counter proposition, said, well, maybe there's also a type of man, and he called this type of man the last man, who is very different and almost is developing in the opposite direction than the Overman. He is nihilist, ascetic, so he shuns the pleasures of life and the beauty and the richness of life, withdraws, he defaults to what I last time called bare life. It's not a Nietzschean term, bare life, but I'm just putting it here. But it's part of that meaning that he, I think, had in mind. This last man, he adheres to traditional or revealed values without questioning, without expanding on them, without overstepping them, without going beyond them. he is what I call a self-castrating object rather than a self-positing subject. He has a herd mentality, not a herd immunity, but a herd mentality. He will follow the crowd, right, and not try for himself to shape his own destiny. And he will therefore avoid conflict. He will be obsessed with security, and this is something that Nietzsche actually said. And he will shun disease, right, because he's afraid. He does not embrace death. He is fearful of death. That's the last man. And when I thought about this curve, it seemed to me that's exactly where we are at now. So our development, maybe the industrial age, the information age, the technology, the science, I don't know what it is. It has taken us on a wrong turn. We are now all just self-castrating objects. Oh, we have to wear masks, we have to social distance. We cannot go to this festival, BBC, they have to postpone it to next year, yes, because of the pandemic. That's exactly the kind of behavior that Nietzsche would have recognized as, okay, we've arrived at the last man. And the last man is associated in Nietzsche's mind with something that Hegel had, one of his teachers, or not a direct teacher, but someone he reacted to, Hegel, had called the end of history. Right? There is a point at which our development stops. At least there's a conceivable point, not an empirical point to Hegel, but it's conceivable that history stops. Right? He thought it stops when we are up there, when we've reached what he calls the absolute. But of course, it could also stop at the other end. It could just stop with the last man. And I think that's what Nietzsche pointed out, right? If we all become last men, maybe history stops. And I'm taking this, it's a very naive interpretation of Nietzsche. Don't quote me on it, but I take this in my own deliberations to mean we really have stopped being humans altogether. A human being is someone who can think, and not only can think, but actually does think, who makes thinking a regular practice in their life. That's my view. It's also someone who not only has an immune system, but they trust their immune system, and they continuously build their immune system as they do any other part of our body. Basically, it means we are embracing our body. If we wanted to be an overman, we would have to be in love with our body, right? And we would have to exercise our body. Not only in the conventional way of saying, yeah, I do sports twice a week and that's good for me. Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. But it also, for example, means we would want to expose ourselves to viruses because it trains our immune system. It makes us stronger. Remember, Nietzsche is the one who said, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Right? It's in this context, maybe, that he said that. I can't remember, but it would fit into this context. If you don't expose yourself to risk and danger and disease and external challenges, you will become a vegetable. So maybe we are, at this point, no longer humans, we are vegetables. Remember the logical song I played last time? Or no, I didn't play it, but I talked about it. It talks about the same thing, right? They sent me to school so that I become a good vegetable. We've all become vegetables, right? And there's a point at which if a very small minority only is left who is not like that, then for all intents and practical purposes, humanity has stopped functioning. If there's almost nobody speaking up against this madness, then we are really in this madness. So I'm proposing that we should consider humanity at least suspended for now. So to me now, humanity as such no longer exists. So you and I are no longer human. And whether it can be resurrected, I'm not certain. Maybe we've just completely abolished the human. Maybe we can still call ourselves Homo sapiens if we want, but it's a misnomer, and we are just an animal. And a very dangerous one to the rest of the world. But we're just an animal. Or maybe a vegetable, which is possible. So, now I come to my title today, Become Who You Are. And this is where I want to meditate for a moment, because this was Nietzsche's favorite motto. It's originally by Pindar, 5th or 6th century BC Greek poet. But he didn't say become, be who you are. He said become who you are. And that's exactly the Nietzschean concept of the Overman, become that Overman. It's about the becoming, moving in that direction, not necessarily arriving. So if we are now vegetables, maybe we can all think about, well, how do we become who we truly are? And with that, I want to just take a few deep breaths, and then we go into the rest. Yeah, thank you for bearing with me. I feel good now. I feel expanded and at ease. The rest of the presentation should be quicker and more straightforward. Where are we on our scenarios? You guessed it. Deep in the fractured world, as always. Where does the vaccine take us? Remember, previously, sort of in December, I think I said, if the world gets going on the production of vaccines, distributes them fairly to all the people around the globe in any country who actually are in the at-risk category, and we could agree on the cutoff points and how we define it. If we did that and then really got the stuff out to them as quickly as we can, at least one shot. Remember, I said that long before the British had that idea, at least one shot. Then we could have been back in early spring by July 2021. We could have got, let's say it's 1 billion out of the 7.8 billion people. I still believe we could have vaccinated 1 billion. I think, in fact, we will be vaccinating 1 billion people by July. So we're actually able to do it, and we will. Just many of them are not the right people. We are vaccinating the wrong people that don't actually need it. And at the same time, those who do need it, in some parts of the world, poorer countries or whatever, they don't get it. So, I've taken the July scenario out because it's now implausible. It could no longer be achieved. I kept it, of course, in the old presentations as a recording, if you like, as a document, documentation that, of course, we could have done that. Right? We could have gotten everybody who actually needs to be vaccinated. We could have gotten them vaccinated by 1st of July. Let's say almost, right? 90% of them. There's always going to be some that you can't find or who don't want, or of course. But we could have, anybody who wanted it among those in the risk group, we could have vaccinated. It would have been totally possible, a stretch, but possible. But we did not. We did not. We chose not to do that, which will cost lives. So the politicians for 1 year have been talking about saving lives. Now is the first time they actually have a means at hand that is really effective in saving lives. and they're not doing it. Oh, they're doing it in some places, but only for their local, national, as if this was a nationalistic kind of thing, community. For the country next door, no. Yeah, that's called mass murder. So what I'm saying here is, well, we could still have a change of mind. I mean, it's never too late to change your strategy. Say, okay, we get it now. We should give this stuff not to our school children or whatever, but we should give it to those who are above 65 or have preconditions, no matter where they're located in the world. And once all of them have had at least one shot, we can open the entire globe without any problem, right? So I'm saying, well, hope springs eternal, and I'm putting in the scenario for December now, so I give an extra 6 months, in case politicians wake up and say, yeah, we can still do this. Not by July now, that would be too late now, but by December. Now, second scenario, and I've talked about this before, we would by December, so again, I've taken the July scenario out because nothing is going to happen by July. Right? The way we are playing this, nothing is going to happen, right? Except for very few locations, like maybe the UK and the US, and maybe a few others. But globally, and this is a global scenario, globally nothing will happen by July. By December, it could. At this stage, I would say that's still plausible. Not very likely, but it's plausible. If, however, a sufficient number of countries, as I said before, insist on using vaccines to create herd immunity rather than protecting the at-risk cohorts, then we will still be in the fractured world, meaning borders will be closed and you will have to have a passport, a vaccination passport, in order to be able to travel, and whatever those restrictions. And I don't have enough imagination. The politicians have much more imagination in creating stumbling blocks for the citizens than I do, so I don't mean to anticipate what other crazy ideas they will come up with, but surely they could come up with more crazy ideas that I can't even anticipate. If enough governments insist on using the vaccine to create herd immunity first, before they give them their basic rights back, then we will still be in the fractured world in December. Nothing will have changed substantially. And if you look at the evidence so far, here's a list of what I've seen. Healthcare workers being the first. That's nice, but most of them are well below 60. They don't really need the stuff. Frontline, but I, as I said before, I have some sympathy for that because they have a lot of exposure. It's psychological. Let's say I have some sympathy for it. There's no rationality for it, right? If there was an argument that, they are more exposed, and if you are exposed to greater dosage of the virus, your risk of having COVID may be higher than with a smaller dose. So, and because they work closely with patients, they may just be exposed to more virus at a time, yeah? So the sheer quantity of that virus that they're exposed to could put them at a higher risk. If that was the argument, then I think that would be a self-defeating argument, because then if they're really exposed, then virtually all, given that 60% of the global population has already been exposed, as of my model, almost all of these health workers who are in any way working with COVID patients, they're even more likely to have been exposed, right? So if almost all of them have already been exposed to the virus, there's no point vaccinating them. Right? They already have their defenses up and trained and ready. Right? So I can see that there is an emotional attachment to giving the stuff to healthcare workers, but I don't think there's a rational one. But it gets worse. That's not the worst thing. The worst is really what they call frontline workers. I love this term because it means nothing, right? Only politicians create such terms, right? Frontline workers. And then you ask me, what does that mean? Armed forces, basically young men, yeah, very much at risk for sure. Police, stewardesses. We have to open up our travel industry, so all the stewardesses have to be vaccinated. unless they're not above 65, which normally stewardesses aren't because they retire by 65. And actually, if they're women anyways, they probably could be 75. Anyways, right? I mean, stewardesses, okay. Teachers, this is a nice one. I talked about it earlier. Teachers. Teachers, why the hell do teachers need this more than anybody else? Taxi drivers, yeah, taxi drivers because they transport people. And well, look, all of us have contacts with other human beings. Not only taxi drivers do, right? We are all in the same boat here. Supermarket staff, I love that one. I don't know which country, but some country is vaccinating supermarket staff. Olympians, I mentioned that, right? Yeah, and so on and so on. I also find essential travel. Businessmen, for example, they're essential for our economy. Therefore, they're being treated, more equal than others, right? As I said before, some animals are more equal than others. Right? And then it gets better still. Now come the good stuff. Sons of politicians have been mentioned, members of parliament and their relatives. Yeah, very self-serving, right? Some animals are way more equal than others, right? I said earlier, this whole vaccination is turning into the world's biggest corruption scheme ever. I love this. I mean, what a simple common cold virus can do to humanity. It's incredible. I love this. So all our VIPs will get it first, and their sons and daughters, and their dog, and I don't know. if you are like me, a 55-year-old man who is totally unimportant to the world, you will be last. Yay. Oh yeah, some countries say, oh, we'll first vaccinate the 18 to 59 years old. But they're not at risk. Yeah, but they're the more socially active, or they're more important for the economy. So it's not actually about giving you your basic rights back. It's just about getting the economic engine going again. That's what it is for. Okay. Now, I'm not against having the economic engine back on track, by all means, right? But yeah, saving lives all of a sudden is no longer a project. I mean, that's, I think, the common thread that runs through all of this. Until we had the vaccines, politicians, we have to save lives, save lives, save lives. We have to lock down, we have to close borders because we have to save lives. Now we have the vaccine. No, saving lives is not our priority. No, we have to get the economy back going, and we have to make sure our Olympians are safe. I mean, it's turning from tragic into a comic, right? It's becoming sheer comedy. Yeah. And I said before, one should have differentiated male and female, but one doesn't, because apparently that's politically incorrect. One rather has people die than being politically incorrect, basically, is the message there. Right. Now, number 3, as I said before, there's still, and there continues to be a possibility that distribution battles ensue, that either between countries or within countries, some countries are starting to turn back the vaccines they had been given and want a refund. There may be mutual non-recognition of the different vaccines, right? Oh, the Chinese one, we haven't got any data, so we don't accept it. And if you are vaccinated with the Chinese one, then that doesn't count. So if your vaccination passport isn't, the EU one or the EU approved vaccinations, then we don't count it, right? So hallelujah. I mean, the best part is yet to come in this comedy, right? As I said before, you can trust all of these vaccines because it's so simple. It's very unlikely that they got something seriously wrong, right? So you can just take any of them, and you can accept any of them, and you can accept whatever the other person has taken is fine. But there is a scenario here where politicians will refuse to do that. No, this is not our vaccine. Doesn't count. You are not a human being. Yeah. And then we are even deeper into the fractured world, right? And then the 4th scenario, beyond maybe 2021, if we get deeper into the fractured world, and then borders remain closed, real normal human mingling doesn't take place. As I said many times before, we will eventually force up the IFR again, because people are getting ever older, and this is only if people don't get vaccinated. Right? If they get vaccinated once, then this doesn't arise. And the second issue is, with border closures, we may get a proliferation of varieties of the virus. We will get a lot more different strands or variations or mutations than if we just open up the world. Because each locked up ecosystem becomes more and more separate ecosystem, and the virus will develop over time, will develop separately in those different. And if 200 countries don't open their borders to each other, that's 200 different ecosystems for the virus. And there will be, instead of a few dozen, there will be a few hundred of variants. I mean, talk about making a simple situation more complicated. There you go, right? Now, that's still possible. I think the scenario that we drive up IFR again because people are getting ever older and more susceptible, I think because vaccines are being administered now, that's probably not a very big risk. Although in some locations where vaccines just don't get there, maybe a risk. But the scenario that we don't open our borders and that we thereby proliferate the varieties of the virus, that is, I think, real. Yeah, so this is, this, no change. The virus is, or the severity of the illness COVID is trending towards insignificant. Within a few months from now, by and large, we will have gone through this in terms of fatalities. There will, of course, still be fatalities, but they will become less and less. So the COVID-19 itself will become, if you like, insignificant or irrelevant almost, right? But the policies we are building around it, those will remain, as I said last time, right? God is dead, but his shadow will haunt us for a long time to come. It's also Nietzsche, right? COVID-19 will have largely disappeared from our radar screen, but the policies we are putting in place, they will stay. So, my model, last time I spent a lot of time on explaining the model. I don't want to do that today, but I want to point out or highlight to you, partially triggered by that article about the suicide rate in Japan. I said I really need to, and I had actually wanted to do this anyways, but I really have to go and look again. One, are there updated excess mortality data? And to some degree there are. And I suspect in the next month or two, more and more governments may publish something because they will look back at last year and it takes a few months. So by March or April, they may actually then be able to really publish relatively solid excess mortality figures, which will inform my model because, as you remember, my model is tied to excess mortality. So I did update all my excess mortality. It was interesting. Some countries were higher than before. Some countries were lower. On balance, slightly lower, but not very different from what I had before. So that's one change. And the other change I've made, which has a bigger impact on this figure here, is based on that suicide rate and just thinking generally that I was a bit conservative. Remember, I had initially said I take it that excess mortality equals COVID fatality. Then about a month or two ago, I made that, last month that I talked about it, I made that adjustment that I said, maybe 90% of excess fatalities are COVID, right? And 10% are other things. They may still be indirectly linked to COVID, right? Such as those suicides, right? Which are an effect of the man-made COVID crisis, right? But so they're linked to this, but they are not fatalities directly from pneumonia or some other disease that you could summarize under the name COVID-19. And so now I'm saying that is, I've calibrated that for different countries. I assume that less of that is the case in the more developed countries and a bit more of that is the case in the less developed countries. And on average, it's 75%. So the excess fatalities that initially I had 100% of that allocated to COVID, then 90%, now it's 75%. So that explains why the COVID fatalities that drive my estimate of the infection level have gone down. Right? Actually, not the total fatalities have gone down, but the proportion of the fatalities that I use to drive this model, because this model is driven off the COVID fatalities times IFR, right? And so the proportion of all excess mortality that I've allocated to COVID fatalities, direct COVID fatalities, has gone down. Not by a huge amount, but significant. And as you can see here, what the result is that the curve goes south this month, which of course cannot be the case, right? The infection level cannot go down; it can only go up, right? Because it just counts, first-time infection. What proportion of the population have had their first infection with SARS-CoV-2? That's what it counts, right? That cannot go down; it can only go up, right? So the fact that my number this month is lower than last month is just an effect of the modeling, right? And I've said that before. A lot of these movements that you see here, they're effects of modeling because I make some tweaks to the model. They're not necessarily representative of something in the real world, like, oh, there's an outburst here in this month. No, there's maybe just a change to the model, right? And I said before, I don't want to take the effort of going back each time I make a change and then rerun the entire model all the way back to the beginning. I just keep it as it was. And just, from this month on, I have a slightly different methodology, and the methodology means, the estimate is a bit lower than it would have been otherwise. That's all, right? And that's why the curve can actually go down this month, even though in real life that could not be the case, right? Because this is just a model. Yeah. So I'm now at 55%, and the projection for the end of the quarter, which is now only 1 month away, is 60%. Yeah, so global penetration is a little bit less than what I had said last month, but the trend hasn't changed. Right? It's just the way methodology works. Okay. Fatalities, as I said, fatalities are somewhat affected, but not as much. They're still going up. You can see last month I had 8.4, now I have 8.9 million total fatalities. This is excess mortality, right? Which is what I used to track. What I've done this month, as I say, I already started last month, but I didn't display it. But this month I'm starting to display that I'm separating the direct COVID fatalities away from the overall mortality. And so the green curve here, that's the direct COVID. And as you can see, that obviously is lower than the total. So, the gap between them, that's, the difference between people who are excess mortality, meaning they died probably somewhat in conjunction with this man-made COVID crisis, but they didn't die directly of pneumonia or anything directly related to COVID, but of something else, such as a suicide in Japan or another location. There are many suicides at the moment, right? So, and other things, right? And as I said before, some of these additional mortality is, what did I call it? I had a name for it. Basically unintended and, inexcusable, right? Just errors being made in the early stage in treatment, etc. Things that, learning curve, you do mistakes and then you learn and then you don't make the same mistake again and things get better. So those types of fatalities are in here, but there are also fatalities which are a direct result of government policy. Yeah. So those, you could say, are people who have been murdered by our governments. And I can't tell you exactly how many. Yeah. I mean, all these data are very rough and ready anyway, so I will never be able to point out, governments have killed so many million people, right? I will not. But I think you can all assume that governments around the world have killed several million people. I mean, people who should not have died, would not have died if the governments hadn't had their policies. And as I said earlier, right now is probably the time that this killing is at the peak, because of those people who have a vaccine in their hand and don't administer it to those people who actually need it, right? So the biggest number of murders by governments are actually happening now. There were a lot of them last year when with lockdowns and all that, and suicides and what have you, but there are probably the biggest number of murders, since World War II or since the Great Leap Forward in China or what, is probably happening right now. Because we have the vaccine and we're not giving it to the people who need it. And people die. Whether it's millions or hundreds of thousands, maybe I'll make an effort at one point to try to calculate it, but I think it will be very hard. Okay, but that's what it is. So next, you remember this is just recap from last time. I was tracking 4 countries, Sweden, because I call it the normal country, Iran, Mexico, and South Africa, because in those 3 countries, there was indication based on my model that they were reaching herd immunity at about 80%. It's my definition now from the evidence I've seen. 80% is sort of start seeing a real effect of herd immunity, meaning fatalities starting really to go down. This takes into account, though, that, as I said before, elderly are less active, and therefore the penetration among the elderly is lower, typically, in most societies, than among the average, right? So if 80% population coverage may only mean 60% coverage among the elderly, right? So there's still a lot of elderly who would not yet have been exposed to the virus, even in these countries, right? And they would therefore still benefit from the vaccines. Right? And also there will still be ongoing fatalities for many months to come, right? Because even if the general population reaches 90% among the target group, the elderly, it may still only be 70 or something like that, So there's still a number of them who have not yet been exposed to the virus and who per step by step, over time become exposed to the virus, and some of them then die unless they've been vaccinated, right? So in other words, even those countries here, Iran, South Africa, Mexico, remember, they will still see fatalities. So I was tracking these, and my green arrows here, they were meant to indicate how I would think they would develop, right? Iran already at a low level. I said they're probably more or less just going to continue flat. These are fatalities, right? Mexico has said, they're just at the cusp of reaching their peak of fatalities, and then they should drop off quite steeply. And South Africa said, they seem to be already past the peak, and so you just expect a fairly steep downward slope, right? And with Sweden, I said, what I recognized there was that Sweden has been backfilling the fatalities. So they're not registering the fatalities in real time. They tend to be probably something like 3 weeks behind. So people die, and then by the time they've registered them, and maybe, as I said, maybe they do applications, or I don't know why they take so much time, but by the time they actually really then register them to a certain date, up to 3 weeks seem to be passing by, and so they keep backfilling fatalities. So this fatality curve here that drops off so steeply is not real. That's just an illusion because the data hasn't been filled in. So their curve ought to be, as I said last time, right, normal seasonal curve. It probably has already peaked in like late December or early January, it peaked. And since then it's probably coming down, but not very steeply. Unlike Iran or Mexico or South Africa, where you have herd immunity, you would expect a steep drop. In Sweden, where you don't have herd immunity, you would expect just a seasonal, gentle kind of dropping off, right? Well into March and even into April, because it takes some time to get through that. So that's why the green curve for Sweden, I anticipated it would be like that, right? Now here's what happened. Oh, sorry. This was last month, and this is now the actual this month. And you can see, it was all correct what I said. So in Iran, here's my little green arrow, hard to see, but basically it's been flat as I had predicted. The last couple of days, it starts ticking up a little bit. I can talk about that in a moment. It's too early to say whether that's relevant or not. It's going to be just sort of normal statistical fluctuation. But basically, it's been flat, as I predicted. Mexico has been pretty much taking that shape that I predicted, and South Africa also has pretty much taken the shape I predicted. So it's pretty much, this is just to say my rationality of what I'm talking about, how this works, seems to be supported by the empirical data. That's all, which is important to me, obviously, because if it wasn't, then I would have a problem. I would have to redefine my thing, and either my concept of the virus would be wrong, or my model would be wrong, or some combination thereof, right? But at the moment, it looks like it's all sort of as I would have predicted. And with Sweden as well, it just keeps, so the same green curves just carries forward. So they're always 2 or 3 weeks behind this filling in the data. Why, I don't know, but that's just an observation, and that's it. There's no further relevance. Okay, the next thing I had said last time, this is another recap slide. I just brought back the slide from last time. Remember, I said, oh, there's something interesting happening, and it's, as my concept would predict, once you have herd immunity, and I was saying Iran seems to have been the first country to sort of get there, as far as I can see. Once you have herd immunity, in a country like Iran that had a lot of activity early on, remember, Iran was one of the first countries last March, that after China, that had significant activity. So that's now almost a year ago. And when March, April, so that period. So let's say 9 to 12 months ago. So since we know that after 6 months, the antibody count in the blood of someone who has been infected starts going down, and in some cases steeply, in other cases not so steeply. There's a big variety of patterns, and people are still researching that. But generally speaking, after 6 months, you would start expecting a decline in the antibodies, right? And that is probably associated with you're becoming susceptible again to being reinfected a second time, right? And next year, then a third time, and a fourth time. We will never stop being susceptible to being infected, right? Just like with any other cold virus, right? It's normal. But in a case like in Iran, where they had an early significant activity last March, April, that means now we are already more than 9 months beyond that. There ought to be a substantial number of people who are now susceptible to reinfection. And since the virus continues to go around, and people, often don't know that they had been infected the first time because they weren't tested or anything. They maybe know only slight symptoms, so they don't know they were infected the first time. Now they get infected again. They get measured. Oh, you have COVID. You're not COVID. Sorry, you're positive for SARS-CoV-2. Okay, they don't maybe even realize that they already had it twice, right? But point being, there could be now in the cases an increasing number of people who repeat infections. They already had it, and now they have it again. And over time, in a year or two, almost everybody who gets infected will be a reinfection, you see, which just means we should stop testing. Not in a hospital. If someone goes to a hospital and is sick, then I said this before, the PCR test is great. As part of your diagnostic, you test whether the person has this virus. Because if the person has a virus and has pneumonia, then you can make a connection. Oh, it looks quite likely that that person has pneumonia that is due to infection with this virus, right? That may help your diagnostic, right? Or it may even help you with some prophylactics and so on. So I'm not against, especially around people at risk, doing things, right? But this wild testing of the entire population at airports and at all kind of wild places, which never made any sense. It makes even less sense now, less than zero, negative sense. No, it makes no sense to continue testing people randomly, where in a few years' time, it could be their third or fourth or fifth time that they get infected. It doesn't matter, right? We're not testing the other 200 common cold viruses either, right? So we can, at any time, we can just stop that wild testing stuff, right? Except, as I said, to protect those who actually need protection. That's the only reason, and to diagnose those who are severely ill, right? But that's it. Otherwise, we could just stop these testing programs. I said this many times before, but the thing is, we're not stopping them. So we are continuing to test. Iran seems to continue to test. So interestingly, a number of infections were rising again, right? Okay. And I said, well, if I'm correct and they have reached herd immunity, then what you would expect is that the number of infections could go up because they're still in the seasonal cycle, right? And it had come down. Maybe they had some lockdowns or done something here. I don't know why it came down. And of course, as I said before, you do expect some steep curve down when you reach herd immunity. So in a way, I was expecting a steep curve. So I wasn't surprised about it. But then it started going up again. And I thought, why would that be? And then, yeah, because Iran, of all places, we know had a lot of infections early, and so therefore they will have a lot of secondary infections now. And because the activity is still strong now, because the season is not finished yet, maybe in a month's time it will be finished. We don't know the details around the cold season in Iran, right? Different climate than Europe, but basically, remember, until 21st of March, and then the season finishes. That's my heuristic, right? So they have another 3 weeks, and then the season ends, and then you will see this curve going down naturally just because of the end of the season. But up to then, it could even go up for a while because there are all these secondary infections now piling in, right? However, I said, if that's the case, the number of deaths should not rise. It can continue to be at the same level because, as I said, a lot of older people haven't yet been infected. Yeah, maybe up to half of all Iranian older people hadn't been yet infected because they're just not as exposed and active, and they will slowly but surely and fairly consistently be infected over the next few months, or it could even be a year or longer until they're all through, right? Unless they get vaccinated before, which we all hope. But so I would expect, even if the left curve, which is the case, goes up, the right curve should not go up, or it may have little bumps, right? Of course, if there's one province in Iran which had not yet been so affected, and now all of a sudden it's really booming there, that can happen, right? Because Iran is a big country. It's not even across the country. So even if 80% of the whole country have been infected, there may be a province where it's only 50%. Yeah, there could still be a lot of activity. And then, of course, short term, there could even still be some additional fatalities because of that. So, I'm not saying it could never go up a little bit, but it should be fairly flat and not have any significant sustained rise. If there was a sustained rise in fatalities in Iran, then my model would be wrong, or my concept of the virus would be wrong. That's what I said, and that's why I'm tracking it, right? So here's what we found. Since what I call the nadir, the low point after it came down was on 29th December. Since 29th December, cases in Iran have started rising again. So slowly and in a bit more accelerated way, not dramatically, but clearly rising. Whereas since that same date, 29th of December, fatalities on a 7-day moving average have been flat. There's a slight uptick in the last couple of days, but that's too early to say anything to that because those upticks can happen. I wouldn't say that's a sustained uptick. But next month we can talk about it. Whether if we see a sustained uptick in the fatalities, then there's something wrong with what I'm saying, right? But at the moment that's not the case, right? So at the moment it's showing exactly what I had anticipated. So it reconfirms, in all likelihood, Iran has reached 80% or so penetration. Now, when I looked at this curve in Iran, I said, looks very similar to the curve in Turkey, right? And Turkey is not one of the countries I've been tracking because I don't have any excess mortality data for Turkey. But look at the Turkey curve at the bottom compared to the Iran curve, right? Very similar, just a few weeks delay, but otherwise the shape very similar, right? Now, what does it mean? Potentially that means Turkey has also reached herd immunity. My model doesn't say that because I don't have Turkey in my model. Again, because I don't have excess mortality figures for Turkey. But the curve, the way it looks, could suggest that Turkey has also reached herd immunity. They had the nadir about 1 month later than Iran. Since then, it's going up again, whereas fatalities continue to drop. Now, as I had said before, the delay of fatalities compared to the registration of the infection could be up to a month, 3 to 4 weeks typically, or sometimes only 2 weeks. So since it's only a bit over 1 month since they reached that nadir, I cannot exclude the possibility that tomorrow Turkey fatalities start going up again, right? Just because in Turkey maybe the delay is a little more than 4 weeks. That could be, right? So I'm holding my breath. But I'm just pointing out to you, it looks like Turkey could be on exactly the same path as Iran, just with 1 month's delay, which means Turkey would also have reached herd immunity. And that then, so I will wait another month and see how it plays out. But if that turns out to maybe really look like it's the case, that not only Iran, but also Turkey have reached that level, and it shows very much in the curves, then I can use this pattern as an indication of which countries have reached herd immunity, you see. They will not all have the same pattern. I mean, Mexico and South Africa, the pattern is a little bit different. Maybe next time I will show you all the different patterns of countries that I think have reached herd immunity. And maybe we can distill a common picture as to, this is the type of behavior and the type of curve you expect to see in a country that has reached herd immunity. And if we can get that picture, like a common view as to how it looks, then we could go systematically through all 200 countries and see whether any of them show that pattern. And that would then be not a proof, but a strong indication that those countries are already at herd immunity. Right? So that could enrich my model from a new angle. So far, I've only built a bottom up where I had mortality figures. With this, if this turns out to work, I could go the other way around and impose a curve, a pattern that is sort of, a standard pattern for herd immunity, and then systematically go through the list and see whether I find countries that show that pattern. Right? And then I could basically say, those countries are at 80%. So that would be a new way, or an additional way, a complementary way to enrich my model and my view of where the world is at. Okay. Third thing I had said last time, India was weird. I said, is this a trick, or are they just lucky? Or, I mean, why the hell is it going down, 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 down? Right? In my model, remember, they were below 50% penetration. Like, can they have reached herd? I mean, this looks a little bit like herd immunity, but not exactly. But they couldn't really have reached herd immunity. I mean, there was no indication from any of the data I used that they were at herd immunity. So unlikely. Then I thought, maybe the Indian government has changed the way they track, or maybe they have reduced cases. But then the fatalities don't reduce just because you do less testing, right? So that, why would the fatalities go down like this, right? And then the third possibility I said was, well, maybe India being such a big country, it's a sort of a multi-track country with multiple provinces being at very different levels. And some of the major provinces may indeed have reached herd immunity. I mean, that would not be impossible. And some other provinces may have been way behind, and they may only be now coming towards like a significant propagation, right? It's like, we had that in Europe. I mean, India is bigger than Europe. Remember, it's twice as many people as all of Europe taken together, right? So you could well have very diverse patterns, right? And that could account for this unexpected downtrend. But if that was the case, I said, remember last time, then you would expect fairly soon it must go up again in both the cases and also the fatalities, right? Because you're not at herd immunity, so therefore the fatalities will not stay this low, right? They shouldn't. I mean, they should come back up again. If it's a multi-speed India with multiple provinces being at different levels, then sooner or later some big province should shoot up, and you should really see that in the overall national data. Yeah, so what happened there? Well, Yes, since about 10 days ago, the cases in India going up again. And I've done some research, and I found that the state of Maharashtra, which is a significant state, has enhanced regional lockdowns and even curfews. And they, on one day, I forgot which day, here, 22nd of February, they had recorded 7,000 cases within 24 hours. So there was clearly here a province where maybe before there had been a bit less activity, now it really, was shooting up, right? And Mumbai was also imposing some new rules. So apparently there was, at least locally in some parts of Mumbai, renewed outbreak. So I mean, this is not very rich data, but it suggests, yeah, there could be this multi-speed idea. Different provinces are at different levels, and maybe you're just seeing the next batch of provinces coming up. Remember the US, how it moved from northeast in New England, then to West Coast, and then Texas, and and then now it's sort of everywhere. But there was different states had different profiles. So that can happen, and depending on how they overlay, it's possible this kind of curve comes about, right? But so what we're expecting now is that the figures in India will go up again, and they seem to be. We'll monitor next time. Though now this India thing, give me a moment. Hold on. The whole question around India that puzzled me brought me to study India a little bit more closely again, which I hadn't done for a couple of months, so that was good. My curve for India was a bit wacky, but that's the green one here, up to last month. Then I looked at the data I already had, and I did all the yellow stars are like real data from real locations. I looked again and found a few new ones. I also found a couple of studies which are not very consistent, but one had 55% penetration of all of India already in early January, based on early January data. And another one from slightly earlier, late December or so, had only 27%. So there's quite a big gap. And you could say, oh, maybe the truth is in between. Yeah, and then my previous green curve was spot on, if that's the case. But I trust, for a variety of reasons, I trust the 55% more. And I also have all these other data that you see here from Pune, Mumbai, Delhi, etc. Ahmedabad. I'm waiting for data from Karnataka, which I thought would have been out by today, but it hasn't yet been out, but it may come in the next week or two, and that may add. So I will continue tracking this a little bit, but I've remodeled my curve a little bit just for India with a little bit of thinking. I'm not wanting to bother you with the details. I'm now having India a bit higher than before, but not anywhere near herd immunity yet, right? So that hasn't really changed. But overall, I'm a little bit more less conservative on penetration in India, right? But the data I collected does suggest that there's something to this multi-speed idea. Some provinces, Pune already has herd immunity, they say, already had it in December. Delhi, Mumbai, they are probably not far away from herd immunity. Ahmedabad is obviously still very far away from herd immunity. Right? Unfortunately, there's no real national survey. So this one study here and this other one, they were tailored studies by certain institutes, but each province is basically doing their own thing. Some are doing these serological studies, others are not doing them, and they're doing them in different months, and they're using different data sets. So I mean, it's great that India is doing so many things. I love it, but it would be even nicer if they were all doing more or less the same thing. But one shouldn't ask for too much. So it's a bit of a puzzle that you have to put together. But I've done what I could, and I think with that, India now is at 56% penetration. Basically, that's the story here. Okay. Yeah. so that was all stuff around why are we saying that COVID-19 is trending towards insignificant, because, all of these data suggest as much. And then remember, the second axis of our scenario is that we're saying the effectiveness of the global response is trending towards poor, and I call it disastrous. No real change here. I mean, we have now had 1 year of this, so 7.8 billion man years have been probably severely disrupted. Almost everybody in the world is probably affected severely by this. I said up here, I said 95 to 99%. I don't really know. Maybe it's 100% actually. There's probably hardly any human being on this planet who is not affected by this. Yeah, and the economy, as said before, heavily affected. And the state of exception that we've created for ourselves with all these policies, it may stay on for several years, if not forever. I mean, this vaccination passport, if it becomes reality, it may be with us for a long time, and it will haunt us long beyond, we've forgotten about COVID. But the passport will still be there if we don't pay attention here. This is really dangerous. You create these things and institutionalize them, and you never get rid of them again. I mean, we know that, right? It's always the same. It's like raising taxes, right? Yeah, we have to temporarily raise taxes because we need money, but don't worry, it will not be a lasting thing. It never goes back, right? Same thing. So whatever we create now, it will haunt us. Okay, finally, my usual time to herd immunity chart, updated. A couple of things. Sweden, last time I hadn't normalized Sweden for, I told you they are backfilling the fatalities. So the data they report isn't up to date. The fatalities are somewhat higher than reported. They are backfilling them later, but because I'm looking at them always at a certain day, which is the first of the months, I take what they report. And this time I've said, no, the gap is significant enough for me to fill it in myself. So I've done a little eyeballing of what the curve should be. And I've just said, okay, there are, X number, I think it's 600 or so fatalities, more than they're reporting. Whether I'm correct with my number or not, but I think it's better this way than not doing it, because I know they're backfilling, right? So I've estimated Swedish fatalities to be a little bit higher than what they record, which means the time to 80% is therefore a little bit shortened, yeah, compared to last time. The other thing I've done, I've shifted Russia. Russia, I've got some new data. It's significantly higher than the previous data. Both are government sources, so it's puzzling. I think I've just averaged them, the two data points, because I couldn't make a decision which one is better. So it's a bit, it's difficult sometimes with these data sets if they're not consistent, right? But Russia, with that adjustments, previously they were below 50%, now they're at 70% penetration. So that's big change. But I also checked, and I didn't find a lot of data on Russia being, systematically, in war with the virus. Maybe they are in some places. But and of course, the media may not report on Russia very much. But I didn't have the impression that they belong into the muddled through group. So I put them into the back to normal group. But this is just a classification that I make up myself. And so it has no further relevance. But I've plugged Russia into the back to normal group. India, I've moved the other way. I've moved it out of back to normal and into muddled through, even though I've raised their penetration level, as I just explained. But the reason is because I looked at it again in more detail, and I realized that the governments are hitting down everywhere, still in many provinces, not everywhere, not unique, not what's the word, not equally in all provinces. I mean, at the very beginning, they had this massive national lockdown, which was catastrophic. When they realized that it was catastrophic, they let go. And since then, the provinces have been doing stuff, and it's very diverse. So it's very hard to figure out. But my feeling is, no, India, a lot of provinces are doing quite a lot of stuff, knocking down on this thing. So they seem more like Europe in that respect, right? And so I've put them into muddled through. So I've shifted some around. I've added the Philippines. Why? Because I've got some excess mortality data for the Philippines now. I'm not sure I can really trust that data, but since I'm using that same data source for other countries, and I trust it, then why shouldn't I trust it for the Philippines either, right? Otherwise, I would be inconsistent with myself, right? So I said, okay, if I trust it for some other countries, then I may as well trust it for the Philippines, even though it looks a little bit low. But that's what it is. And so according to that, the Philippines really are not yet very penetrated, much less than Indonesia, yeah, which is a bit not really what I expected, but that's what the mortality figures that I found suggest. So I think, okay, I accept that. They are more similar to Thailand. So I plugged them in here at the new normal because apparently they must be doing a lot of things to hammer down. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to explain the low penetration. Okay, so those are the changes to this chart. And as you can see, I've always said Sweden would be your normal country if people are conscious, deliberate, more or less dependable, and responsible in terms of keeping some social distancing and behaving in a rational way. Then that's what you get, right? So they would still take probably 2 more annual seasons to get fully through this. So maybe 1 would be sufficient because we are not yet quite at the end of this cycle, right? And then maybe 1 more. But they certainly, without the vaccines, they would have to continue having this cautious approach among the population for at least 1 full more cycle, meaning at least until April 2022, if not a bit longer. And maybe even into a 3rd cycle, right? So that's interesting, right? So if you're very disciplined like the Swedes, it basically takes 3 years. I think I suggested that before. I think it's not really changed. It takes about 3 years if you're Sweden to get through this, without the vaccines, of course. Of course, they will start vaccinating. Back to normal countries are countries that more or less allowed the virus to proliferate. I mean, they had measures, but not too many. In some parts of the country, like the US, maybe more than in other parts, depends on the state or the province and so on. But, and those states are all now either already at herd immunity or not that far away, only maybe a handful of months away from herd immunity, naturally. Right? Of course, the US is now massively vaccinating, so they will never reach a natural level of herd immunity because they will reach it faster than these 7 months, thanks to the vaccinations. I mean, if they continue like they're doing now, they should be through, they could even reach herd immunity with vaccinations by, September or so, I think. I mean, as I said many times, you don't need to get to herd immunity by vaccination. You just have to vaccinate the people who really need it, right? I keep saying the same thing. But if you insist on getting herd immunity through vaccinations, the US will get there pretty quick. And if they don't, then the natural herd immunity will kick in anyways, right? So it doesn't really matter. Except it does matter. And so far, remember, the older people are behind. So if it's 7 months for the general population, maybe it is 10 or 12 months for the elderly. So don't get me wrong, it's still very relevant for the US, as any other country, to go and vaccinate those people who need it, right, as quickly as possible. That's true for all countries, right? Even in countries like Iran or Mexico, so where they're really almost getting to like 90% or so of population penetration, that still means that only maybe 60 or 70% of the elderly have been penetrated, and that means 30 or even 40% of the elderly have not yet been exposed, and they will benefit from getting this shot, right? I repeat myself so that I'm not misunderstood. I'm totally in favor of everybody who needs it getting the shot as quickly as possible. That's very clear, right? All I'm saying is, even where they don't, many countries are already getting to a point where there's a natural herd immunity, at least at some level, meaning overall proliferation will slow down, and that does give some level of protection to those who have not yet, those elderly who have not yet been exposed. Right? So generally the activity will slow down for everybody, and therefore fatalities will slow down even in the absence of vaccines. Right? But they will not go to zero, as we see in Iran, in the absence of a vaccine. Right? There will still be significant fatalities even after herd immunity. right? Just because the way the virus works. So vaccines, even in Iran, still very useful, and the quicker the better. Just give them to the right people, the ones who actually need them, not to your president and your prime minister. Your president is probably over 60, so yeah, of course he should be in the group. But I mean, not to the son of the president who is maybe 30, right? He doesn't need it, right? So if everybody did the right thing, we would get through this very quickly. That's the message here. Anywhere in the world, as I said, we could have been through this by July this year if we had, I mean, with the vaccinations, if we had wanted to. And I'm now saying, well, we didn't, but by December, let's say, we could definitely all be through this, right? If we wanted to. So maybe I should pray a little bit. I'm not very religious, but pray that the politicians start waking up. Yeah? Okay, anyways, that was my last chart. No, it wasn't. My second last chart, I think. Economic impact. I wanted to add this because now we've got relatively decent estimates of GDP for 2020. This is not, in most countries, not final numbers yet. So they're yet to report the final number for the year 2020. But these are probably now pretty close estimates, you know? Just take them for that. So yes, these numbers may change a little bit, but probably not too much. And what I've shown here is the blue bar is the latest, which points down in all cases, is the latest projection that I have. So negative GDP growth in all these countries I'm showing here. Indonesia is the one that is least negative. It's got only minus 1.1% projected. And then the green bar that points up was the original projection as of December 2019 or January 2020, when they made their final projection for the year 2020 at the beginning of the year. This is what they projected. So for example, Indonesia had projected that their GDP, not knowing anything about COVID, right? The pre-COVID projection was that they would have a plus 5.1% growth. Now they're saying, a year later, looking back, they're saying, oh, it's going to be minus 1.1. So the delta, the gap, the difference between the original forecast and what is now estimated to be the case is plus 5.1 minus the negative number. So minus, double minus is plus, right? So you add it on top. 5.1 plus 1.1 is 6.2. So what they're losing, thanks to the COVID crisis, remember, man-made COVID crisis, yeah, I repeat myself, thanks to the man-made COVID crisis that we've created, Indonesia's GDP will be 6.2% less this year, last year, than it should have been. Yeah? That's what this delta, this red figure here under the country is the delta, right? Okay. So Indonesia, not too bad, it's 6.2%. Look at the Philippines, it's 15% between what it could have been and what it will probably end up being. Or India, I mean, 14. Or among the Western countries, UK, 11.4%. This is distracted wealth of all of us, distracted by our politicians and by all of us because we are voting for these politicians and we're even cheering them for destroying our wealth. This is the wealth we have destroyed last year because of a common cold virus. It's a comedy. It's fun. Yeah. Now, what's interesting though is to look at some of these countries. So Sweden, remember, they didn't do lockdowns. They just continued like normal. They still have a 4% gap because they're part of the European Union. They're part of the global economy. If everybody else does this stuff, then, you know, of course they're affected. They're heavily export dependent, heavily tourism dependent, et cetera, right? So even Sweden, although they didn't lock down their restaurants and their service sectors and so on, have a 4% gap, right? None of their own fault, basically. It's just, this is imposed on them by all the others. But yeah, but it is noteworthy that that's the lowest of all the countries I was looking at here, right? And I didn't like handpick them so that, you know, if you find one that is even lower, share it with me, but don't make it China because China data is not trustworthy. Make it a country where the data is trustworthy. Yeah? But if you find a country, maybe Vietnam, Vietnam maybe, you know, I think Vietnam may have a better performance, but, you know, I don't trust their their data either, especially the fatality data. I don't trust it at all. So similar case to China. So you have to, if you want to bring a country that had a better performance than Sweden, please do, but make sure the data is trustworthy, okay? So of the countries I'm tracking, Sweden had clearly the best economic performance, yeah? Not surprising. That's what it should be, right? Because they didn't hammer down on the economy, right? And I said last time, their fatalities are average in the EU, but their economic performance is twice as good as the EU average. If you look at the EU, minus 8.2, Sweden is minus 4, so twice as good, right? Or even even more than twice. I mean, the starting point was similar, what they were expecting to grow, but if you look now at what's actually happened, EU is like 2.5 times as bad almost, right? So and don't even look at the UK or some other countries, but yeah. So Sweden has done well by comparison, as you would expect. The US has done well by comparison, which you would also expect because they haven't done too much in the way of cranking down. And also, as you know, the US is always very entrepreneurial and they always find ways to even make money in a crisis. So it's their strengths. We should grant them that. Germany hasn't done too poorly, although they have been cranking down heavily, but they've done it on a local level in a slightly more clever way than most other countries. I would grant them that. I mean, they have done the madness slightly less madly, if that makes sense. They've done the same madness, but slightly less madly. UK was the maddest of them all, but I mean, they're making up for it now with having the best vaccination program, to be fair to them. Thailand is a disaster because, of course, 20% of the economy is tourism, and they have just completely closed it down. I don't really believe these numbers. It should be a lot worse than this, actually. I don't know how these numbers come about, but okay. Philippines is run by a madman. I mean, a real madman. Not only as mad as all the others, but madder than mad, right? I mean, that guy is a real nut, right? So that's what you get when you vote for a president who is a complete madman. India, I think, actually doing a lot of things right now, I think, but at the beginning, they had this really massive, dramatic lockdown nationwide that must have been horrendous, and who knows how many people it killed. And I mean, it destroyed so much, right? If you recall, they had a few months, it was just incredible, right? And I think they've probably made up for it a little bit since, but the damage was so huge in the early stage that the annual numbers look very, very poor, right? Okay, so that's the economic picture. Just to give you sort of a quick view. And I end with some hopeful quotes, which I just leave to you to read because they somehow, one way or another, relate to us today. And maybe time will reveal whether there's still any humanity left in us or not. With that, skål.